Life has an uncanny way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. Sometimes these surprises shake the very foundation of what we believe to be possible, challenging our understanding of the world around us. The story of Velma Thomas, a woman whose incredible experience defies medical and scientific explanations, is one such surprising tale. Her story transcends the boundaries of life and death, offering not only an extraordinary testament to the power of love and faith, but also an insight into the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding. A life built on faith and service. Velma Thomas was not someone who would stand out in the eyes of the world. She was not a celebrity, nor was she known for doing anything that would place her in the spotlight. Instead, Velma lived a humble, quiet life in the rolling hills of West Virginia, where she became an integral part of her community. Her life had been one of devotion to her faith, her family, and the people around her. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, her selflessness, and her unwavering support for those in need. Her mornings were filled with activities rooted in love and care. She woke up early to tend to her household duties, often preparing meals for her family and neighbors. In her free time, she volunteered at church, organized community events, and was always there to lend a helping hand to those who needed it. Her warm smile and gentle demeanor made her a beloved figure in the neighborhood. In many ways, she was the heart of her community, always there for others, but rarely asking for anything in return. At 59 years old, Velma had established a comforting routine. She had lived through the ups and downs that life had thrown her way, raised children, supported her husband, and had weathered both the joys and the hardships of life. By October 2, 2008, she was content. Her days were filled with the simple pleasures of family and faith. She thought little of anything that might challenge her peaceful existence. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The morning that would change everything. On that crisp morning in October, Velma went about her usual routine. She woke up early, made breakfast, and tended to her household chores. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. But as the morning progressed, something subtle began to shift. At first, it was nothing more than a slight discomfort, the kind of feeling many would dismiss as fatigue, or perhaps a minor bout of indigestion. Velma, like many others, had grown accustomed to minor aches and pains. But this discomfort was different, more insistent, more intense. It gradually morphed into a feeling that made her pause and reassess. She started to experience severe chest pain, a crushing sensation that stole her breath away. Her heart began to race, and the simple act of moving from one place to another left her winded. The pain in her chest radiated out, accompanied by shortness of breath that made it nearly impossible for her to function normally. This wasn't just a passing discomfort. It felt as though something far more serious was happening within her body. Velma's family, ever attentive to her well-being, quickly realized the severity of the situation. Her son, Tim, remembered the moment vividly. "Mom wasn't looking right," he later recalled. "Her face had gone pale and she was struggling to breathe. I'd never seen her like that before." Instinctively, they knew they had to act quickly. Without hesitation, Tim called emergency services. The sound of sirens cut through the morning air as paramedics arrived at their home within minutes. Velma, still struggling to breathe, was carefully lifted into the ambulance. The ride to the hospital was a blur, a rush of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. In those moments, time seemed to stretch, each passing second feeling like an eternity. The family followed closely behind, a sense of dread building within them as they wondered what the outcome would be. The emergency room, a race against time. Upon arriving at the hospital, Velma was immediately surrounded by a team of medical professionals. The emergency room, usually a place of controlled chaos, erupted into focused activity. Doctors and nurses worked swiftly, assessing her condition and beginning the process of stabilizing her. The diagnosis came quickly and was severe, Velma was suffering from a massive heart attack. Her heart was not just in distress, but on the verge of failing completely. Dr. James Mitchell, the attending physician, would later describe it as one of the most challenging cases of his career. When Mrs. Thomas came in, we knew we were dealing with a severe cardiac event, he would say. But none of us could have predicted how this case would unfold. The medical team went to work with practiced precision. Medications were administered, monitoring equipment was attached, and doctors made the quick decision to initiate resuscitation measures. Velma's heart, however, continued to struggle. Her vital signs weakened rapidly, and the situation became increasingly dire. The urgency in the room heightened as each decision became critical. Despite their best efforts, Velma's heart stopped altogether, plunging the room into a frenzied rush to resuscitate her. The sound of chest compressions filled the room as medical professionals worked tirelessly to restart Velma's heart. But despite every intervention, the seconds passed, and it became increasingly clear that her body was not responding. For what seemed like hours, the medical team fought on, refusing to give up, even as the situation grew bleaker. Each passing minute diminished the chance for a successful recovery. Finally, after all possible measures had been exhausted, Dr. Mitchell was forced to make the hardest decision any doctor can face. With no detectable brain activity, and after everything that could be done had been attempted, he made the call. Velma Thomas had passed away. The time of death was recorded, and the machines that had kept her alive were gradually turned off. The family, having been in the waiting room during the resuscitation attempts, were devastated. Tim, who had been pacing for what felt like hours, collapsed into a chair when he was informed of his mother's passing. "I couldn't believe it," he said. "Mum was always so strong, so full of life. The idea that she could be gone just like that, it didn't seem real." A moment of grief and goodbye. In the aftermath of Velma's death, the family was given time to process their grief. A private room was made available where they could gather to say their final goodbyes. Friends and extended family began to arrive, and each new arrival deepened the sorrow. The hospital room, once a place of urgent medical activity, became a place of mourning. Tears, prayers, and memories filled the space as Velma's loved ones shared stories of her life, her love, and the impact she had on so many. Tim, however, couldn't bear to leave his mother's side. Despite the passing hours, he stayed by her, holding her hand and reflecting on the many ways she had been there for him throughout his life. He didn't know how to let go, didn't know how to leave the woman who had always been his rock. The medical staff, understanding his need for closure, allowed him to remain with her through the night. They checked in periodically, but for the most part they left him to his vigil, giving him the space he needed. A miracle unfolds, the impossible return. 17 hours passed. The night had settled into a heavy silence when something miraculous occurred. It began with the smallest of movements, a slight twitch of Velma's hand. At first, Tim thought it was just a trick of his mind, a desperate hope playing tricks on him. But then it happened again. This time he leaned in closer, almost afraid to believe what he was seeing. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief. A nurse, who had come to check on the situation, noticed something even more extraordinary. There was a faint but distinct pulse on the monitoring equipment, something that shouldn't have been possible after 17 hours of being clinically dead. At first, the nurse thought it was a malfunction. But as she checked the readings again, she realized what she was seeing was real. There was a pulse. Velma's body had started to show signs of life. The medical team rushed back into the room, stunned by what they were witnessing. Velma, who had been declared dead hours earlier, was now showing the unmistakable signs of life. Her body temperature, which had cooled, began to rise. Her color, once pale, started to return. The most remarkable of all, however, was the activity in her brain. Though faint at first, there were signs of brain function, an impossible reality given the extended period of time she had been without oxygen. The medical staff worked with renewed urgency, monitoring her closely and administering oxygen. As the minutes passed, Velma's condition continued to improve. Her breathing became more regular, her color returned to her cheeks, and she appeared more alert. The medical staff, still in shock, found themselves trying to understand what was happening. There was no medical explanation for what they were witnessing. "In all my years of practice," Dr. Mitchell later said, "I've never seen anything like this." Tim, who had been sitting in stunned silence, now watched in awe as his mother began to regain consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open slowly. She blinked and then her gaze focused on him. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of awareness. She was fully awake. "Mom?" Tim whispered again, his voice filled with joy and disbelief. "I'm here," Velma replied softly, her voice filled with calm certainty. The words were simple, but they carried profound significance. The Velma Thomas, a life transformed by faith and family. Velma Thomas had long been a fixture in the quiet hills of West Virginia. Her life had been one of service, faith, and community, a life characterized by a deep and unwavering commitment to the people around her. Whether organizing church events, offering a helping hand to a neighbor in need, or simply providing a listening ear for anyone who needed it, Velma's presence in the community was a comfort to those who knew her. Her kind-hearted nature and selflessness earned her the respect and admiration of her friends and family alike. A warm smile and a gentle demeanor defined her personality. Velma was the kind of person who gave so much of herself to others, and her life was an embodiment of love and service. Her love for her family, particularly her son Tim, was boundless. She was a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a treasured friend. Those who knew her best would often say she was a rock, someone to lean on in times of trouble or uncertainty. But in the quiet of her home in 2008, no one could have predicted that Velma Thomas would soon become the center of one of the most extraordinary medical events in recent memory. An event that would challenge not just the medical community, but the very concepts of life and death themselves. The calm before the storm. October 2nd, 2008, began like any other day in Velma's life. At 59, she had settled into a comfortable routine, balancing her responsibilities as a mother, community volunteer, and active member of her church. She had long since found peace in the rhythms of daily life. She had always been a creature of habit, waking up early, preparing breakfast for her family, and tackling her daily tasks with quiet efficiency. The day seemed no different from any other until something began to stir within her body, a feeling she couldn't ignore. At first, it was just a slight discomfort, a vague sensation of tightness in her chest. It wasn't the kind of pain that would send most people into a panic. It felt like something she might be able to brush off as indigestion or fatigue. However, as the minutes ticked by, the discomfort worsened, slowly growing in intensity. As a person who had always been able to handle physical strain and manage stress without complaint, Velma dismissed her symptoms initially. Yet, her body had a different story to tell. Soon the discomfort turned into a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, and Velma began to struggle for breath. Even simple movements such as walking across the room became an exhausting challenge. A sense of panic started to settle in, and she realized that this was not just another ordinary ailment. Her body was sending her an urgent message. Something was seriously wrong. The family's quick response. Velma's family, particularly her son Tim, were quick to notice the changes in her appearance and behavior. Tim had grown up knowing his mother as a pillar of strength. She was always there to take care of him and his siblings, offering support, guidance, and unconditional love. To see her in such distress was unnerving. Mom wasn't looking right, Tim later recalled. Her face had gone pale, and she was struggling to catch her breath. I'd never seen her like that before. I knew something was really wrong. With alarming speed, the family sprang into action. Without hesitation, they called emergency services, realizing the seriousness of the situation. The familiar sound of the sirens that had often signified safety and relief was now a signal of impending crisis. As the paramedics arrived at their home, Velma's condition continued to worsen. Her breathing became shallow and she could no longer move without difficulty. The paramedics worked quickly to assess her and prepare her for transport to the hospital. As the ambulance raced through the winding roads toward the hospital, Velma's family followed behind in their own car. Tim sat in the back seat, his mind a blur of worry and disbelief. The seconds felt like hours as they sped through the streets, the flashing lights of the ambulance reflecting off the walls of the buildings as the world outside seemed to blur together. The emergency room. Upon their arrival at the hospital, the medical team was ready. Velma was immediately wheeled into the emergency room, where a team of doctors and nurses swiftly surrounded her. Dr. James Mitchell, the attending physician on duty that day, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. "We knew right away that we were dealing with something very serious," Dr. Mitchell later explained. "Her vital signs were unstable, and we could see that she was in distress. Her condition was rapidly deteriorating." The team worked swiftly and methodically, administering medications and attaching monitors to her body. The room was a flurry of movement as doctors and nurses communicated in quick, decisive terms, making every second count. For Velma, each breath she took seemed more difficult than the last. The pain in her chest intensified, and her heart struggled to maintain its rhythm. A heartbreaking diagnosis. Within moments, the diagnosis was clear. Velma was suffering from a massive heart attack. The team began their efforts to stabilize her, using defibrillators to attempt to shock her heart back into a normal rhythm. But despite their best efforts, Velma's heart continued to falter. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. The scene in the emergency room grew increasingly dire. The medical team moved with practiced precision, but even their expertise could not halt the decline of Velma's condition. Her heart continued to struggle, and her blood pressure plummeted. Hours seemed to pass in what felt like mere minutes. Dr. Mitchell was particularly struck by the severity of Velma's condition. "I've seen a lot of cardiac arrests in my career," he later said. But this was something different. She was not responding to any of the treatments we were giving her. It seemed like we were losing her, and no matter what we did, her heart just wouldn't recover. The inevitable moment. The situation became increasingly hopeless. Velma's heart finally stopped altogether. The medical team immediately began resuscitation efforts, performing CPR in an attempt to restart her heart. The rhythmic sound of chest compressions echoed through the room as doctors and nurses called out orders and made split-second decisions. But as time passed, the chances of revival grew slimmer. After hours of tireless effort, Dr. Mitchell was faced with the heartbreaking reality that Velma had passed away. There was no detectable brain activity, and her body had gone cold. The medical team, though devastated by the loss, had done everything in their power. They had tried every procedure, every intervention, but in the end, Velma's body had succumbed to the heart attack. The time of death was recorded, and the machines that had been keeping Velma alive were switched off. For Tim and the rest of the family, the world came crashing down. Tim, who had been pacing the waiting room, collapsed into a chair as the news was delivered. The shock and sorrow were overwhelming. "I couldn't believe it," Tim recalled. "Mum was always so strong, so full of life. The idea that she could be gone just like that. It didn't seem real." The vigil. As the hospital staff gave the family time to process their grief, they moved Velma's body into a private room where family members could gather to say their final goodbyes. The hospital room became a place of mourning, filled with tears, prayers, and shared memories of a life well lived. Friends and extended family arrived, offering their condolences and sharing in the grief of the Thomas family. The hours ticked by and the heavy silence of loss settled over the room. As the evening wore on, most of the family members left, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. But Tim couldn't bring himself to leave his mother's side. He stayed by her body, holding her hand, reflecting on the years they had shared. The hospital staff allowed him to stay, understanding his need for closure. They checked in periodically, offering comfort and support, but they didn't rush him. Tim was in a state of quiet reflection, not wanting to let go of the woman who had shaped his entire life. A miraculous return hours passed, 17 to be exact, before something extraordinary occurred. Velma's body, which had been still and lifeless for nearly a full day, began to show signs of life. It started with a faint twitch of her hand. At first, Tim thought he had imagined it, but then it happened again. His heart began to race, unsure whether his grief-stricken mind was playing tricks on him. When Velma's pulse began to register on the monitoring equipment, it was initially dismissed as a malfunction, but upon closer inspection, the pulse was real. Within minutes, the medical team rushed back into the room to reassess the situation. Doctors and nurses who had pronounced Velma dead were now witnessing a phenomenon they could not explain. Her pulse was becoming stronger, her brain activity more pronounced. To the astonishment of everyone in the room, Velma Thomas, who had been clinically dead for 17 hours, was coming back to life.